Thank you, Chris, for that introduction and for inviting me here to the University of Dallas, where it's just so great to be back. I've been here a few times, and it's a fantastic college and university. I have a lot of friends here. It's such an honor and joy to be with you for a couple of days. So thank you very much. And Provost, thank you so much for your kind words of welcome.
One thing I didn't mention, I should have mentioned, is that Michael was one of the founding members of the American Public Philosophy Institute.
Yeah,
It was founded
that's
in
true.
1989.
Wow.
Much younger.
I once gave a talk at a chateau in Canada after dinner on Rawls's philosophy to basically a group of lawyers, and everybody fell asleep. It was really much too heavy. And I think I forgot that lesson when I wrote this lecture. It's a little bit heavy. When I gave a lecture in Brazil, some graduate students came up and they said, "This is fantastic. We don't read anyone who writes English like this anymore. You reminded us a lot like Henry James." So maybe they thought it was a good test of their English skills. But in any case, I don't know. I try to make it light, but you might find it a little bit it's going to be, you have to pay attention. All right, so just a warning. Maybe I don't know, throw in some jokes or do balloon animals or something like that. By the way, no one asks me to do talks on work-life balance. I realize that, right? I have 15 children too, actually, but but no one has ever asked me to give such a talk, ever. Maybe it's because I'm imbalanced. I think that may be the reason why. For my wife, she raised 6 children. One had passed away of crib death. So 6 children from an earlier marriage. My first wife died of cancer, and then we've had 8 children of our own. So she's been a stepmom and a mom, and PhD from Harvard and all that. So okay. And, I require a lot of maintenance, too, I guess. That's the problem, right? All right, so this is called the Foundations of Natural Law. So my object in this lecture is basically to try to get clear on what natural law is. Not so much to give a theory of natural law, but what we should be trying to give a theory about, because I think we actually tend to miss the mark about what it is. So when we speak of the natural law, we are meant to be dealing with matters so deep that typically they are presupposed and taken for granted rather than noticed. I will give you an example. You have read the opening lines of the Declaration of Independence 100 times, probably here at the University of Dallas, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I hope that's correct, because I quoted it from memory. I didn't look that up. Now, it is a small point, but consider what is presupposed but not stated as regards human endowment in these lines. An endowment is a gift. For something to be endowed by the Creator is for it to be a gift implicit in our nature. We are endowed with rights, the Declaration says, but as these rights are self-evident, we are apparently also endowed with a natural capacity not simply to notice these rights, but also to bind ourselves by them and heed them. All right, so that's presupposed, that we're endowed with the capacity to recognize these rights. You might say, well, the Declaration says that these rights are self-evident, which is a phrase that brings inquiry to an end. One either sees it or not, and nothing more can be said. The Declaration is saying that these are starting points. They are the axioms of democracy, as it were, as Lincoln referred to them. And yet it remains true that all men are equal is not self-evident in the manner of a so-called analytic truth, that the term predicated is contained in the subject. Likewise, a human being is endowed with the right to life is not self-evident in that way. Well, don't get me wrong, I'm not denying the self-evidence of these claims. I am saying that what the term self-evident carries with it implicitly is the idea that we are so made that we naturally find them self-evident. What the Declaration ought to say, to be complete, is that all men are created equal and they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, and they are also endowed by their Creator with a propensity easily to recognize and heed these rights. This is presupposed and taken for granted in the term self-evident, and the doctrine of natural law is meant to occupy a similar conceptual space. Remember, I said it's meant to be something that plays the role in our thought, which is so much taken for granted that we hardly notice it. So I've drawn your attention to something taken for granted, and probably, I would guess, not noticed by you ever in thinking about these opening lines of the Declaration of Independence. Or consider the idea that these rights are unalienable. That is to say, they cannot be alienated. That is, we cannot bargain or trade them away in exchange for anything in any contract with anyone. That is what the term unalienable means. I wonder if you knew that. That's what it actually means there. We cannot trade or bargain these rights away, not in the sense that it is impossible for us to do so or that we cannot attempt to do it, but rather in the sense that it would be fundamentally impermissible for us to do so. Any such contract would be null and void from the start. But how so? What is it that, more fundamental than these rights, stipulates that contracts must abide by certain restrictions such that these rights may not be alienated? Or sometimes a presupposition becomes obvious by changing the terms. Suppose we adopt the language of the state of nature and say that in the state of nature all men are bound antecedently by the prescription, thou shalt not murder. That is, one may not deliberately and directly take the life of a non-aggressor. No individual, no conspiracy of individuals, no corporate body may do so. Since this prescription is prior, no subsequent agreements that we reach can touch it. In particular, through forming a contract with others to form and enter into political society, we do not touch the prescription, thou shalt not murder. So that the government, simply a corporate body with a fiduciary responsibility to the people, is similarly prescribed for murdering. But of course it can take someone's life or liberty or property in retribution as punishment for a prior offense after an appropriate finding through a legal due process. That is, citizens may not be deprived of life without due process of law. That is in violation of their right to life. That is in violation of thou shalt not murder. Nothing changes about thou shalt not murder in the transition from the state of nature to political society. So from this point of view, when we ask what is presupposed in the notion of an unalienable right, we find not simply that natural law occupies a similar conceptual space, but it also seems simply to be what does occupy that space. When we look for what can function in this manner, as setting a constraint on everything else in a domain, we might think of first principles. For example, the principles of arithmetic work as first principles in any matter involving discrete quantity. That is, in any domain whatsoever, because everything admits of being counted. We are free to reason, explore, investigate, and postulate as we wish, but on pain of observing the basic arithmetic truths. 2 plus 2 never equals 5, not even in theology. You can tell how many of you are reading blogs by that statement. If I believed I had 2 pennies in one hand and 2 in the other, and then I undertook to combine the contents of my hands, and found upon counting that there were 5 coins there, the one thing I would not be allowed to conclude is that this was the unusual instance where 2 and 2 made 5. Sometimes people put the point in a Kantian way. Kantian, if you're from the University of Edinburgh. No possible experience could count towards establishing that 2 and 2 made 5. But one needs to study philosophy to speak in this way. What we might say everyone naturally and easily comes to know is that in reality, just 2 things added to just 2 things cannot equal 5 things. That's self-evident, if you will, not through the predicates being contained in the subject term. Or maybe we could say that for 2 and 2 to equal 5, one of the 2's would have to have been equal to 3, so that, as St. Thomas might have put it, an improper part was greater than the whole, and things equal to the same thing would not be equal to each other, and one and the same thing would both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. The denial of this arithmetic truth seems to touch immediately even more basic truths. Now, St. Thomas, okay, so let me just retrace some steps. So first thing I said is that natural law is meant to occupy a space in our thought in the manner of a very deep presupposition, so much that it's hardly noticed. And then I raise the question, well, is it functioning in the manner of a first principle, like 2 + 2 = 4? And I tried to give a sense of how that functions, right? And now I want to deny that it does, that these natural law is not supposed to function in that way. St. Thomas and Aristotle, I'll follow them here, would say that only in speculative thought, when we simply wish to see what is so, is it the case that first principles or axioms constrain on a going forward basis, you might say. They function so as to set down pathways in which we can see the coherence of a discipline is preserved, such as from the opening, and here's an analogy, from the opening arrangement of chess pieces and legally allowable moves, one may calculate all the positions of the chessboard which can be arrived at through a series of legal moves. Positions which fall outside of these, such as having the pawns on the first row, make no sense. They cannot contribute to theory about chess. They're simply incoherent. They are not positions of a chessboard, but the placement of shaped pieces on a checkered board. However, first principles in practical reasoning function in a backward-working manner, in the manner of ends or goals, and they constrain more widely the more closely they are connected with the posited end. If, for example, I am skiing a slalom course, an example that occurred to me because of the Olympics, right? And I'm told that if I have the fastest time, before I am awarded the prize, all the gates will be rechecked to be sure I pass through all of them. Then, and this used to be done at the end of the race, they'd actually get messengers going up and down the hill to confirm that all the gates were passed through. Right? Then in order to win, I am constrained to pass through the gates. We imagine that someone at the top of the hill is from the start then constrained to pass through the gates. But obviously he is not, since many competitors miss the gates. He is so constrained only on the supposition of the end. Each gate defines, if you will, a portion of the path he must trace to have skied the path, the completion of which in the fastest time is his goal. In comparison, if in doing a math problem I veer off course and write down for 5 for 2 + 2, to that extent I've stopped doing mathematics. I write down 4 because I am so constrained looking forward from the preceding sum 2 + 2. That is, on this view, constraint deriving from the end may look like it is imposed through first principles that constrain on pain of incoherence going forward, but in fact it does not work in that way. Please come and sit down. There's some seats here, and you don't want to stand up for the whole lecture. And you probably don't want to keep your baseball caps on, too, during the whole lecture. Or at least give me one. No, not at all. I interrupted myself, so that's allowable. It seems that the truths of arithmetic are not dispensable. It would never make sense to put them aside in favor of some procedure of thought deemed more reasonable to see if by that procedure arithmetic might be vindicated. When Whitehead and Russell, after 350 pages of dense proofs in Principia Mathematica, using a set theoretic system known as the theory of types, wrote famously that with a few more assumptions, they had just produced a proof of 1 plus 1 equals 2. That's a picture from the book. It wasn't that they had shown that simple claim was true. Actually, they were producing a set theoretic model of that arithmetic truth. It was not dogmatism for them to assume arithmetic in advance of their project. That they modeled the truth correctly was a constraint imposed on their project. If their system showed that 1 plus 1 were equal to 3, the system would be shown wrong. Similarly, suppose a utilitarian adds 2 utiles produced by an action in one person to two utiles produced by the same action in another person, and concludes that the result for the pair stemming from that action is 4 utiles total of social utility. He does so without first applying the utilitarian calculus to see whether he ought to conclude that 2 plus 2 sums to 4. That is, he does not check to see that that conclusion, 2 plus 2 equals 4, is utility maximizing. Nor if he did, would that be the honest reason for using the truth that 2 plus 2 equals 4. He is correct to presuppose arithmetic as a prior constraint on any investigation involving discrete quantity. To do so would not be dogmatism. But if what is called natural law exists, right, again, this is the place it's supposed to occupy, then thou shalt not kill should equally be presupposed by the utilitarian. That would not be dogmatism, and if there were a procedure that gave a different outcome, it would thereby show that utilitarianism or that procedure were wrong. Okay, again, I'm just trying to say what place it's supposed to occupy. Admittedly, it seems difficult to see why principles of practical reason should have a status similar to arithmetic. Arithmetic being apparently universal in scope, applying to the most distant quasars as much as to pennies in my pocket. But thou shalt not kill, it is thought, involves the very parochial question of the behavior of a particular primate species on a planet revolving around a nondescript sun located on the edge of a nondescript galaxy in a universe with, at last count, over 400 billion galaxies. Isn't that correct, Ted Morin? My physical description of the world? A shout out to Ted Morin. Yet at the same time, it seems telling that we do know about the universe as a whole in this way. That is, we are parochial beings, at least, who view ourselves as on a path to knowing everything about the universe, and that we find it easy to attribute this knowledge to all of us. We know this, we say. We take ourselves to be on the path of knowing everything. But there is an additional point to be made about the matter of presupposition of principles of natural law. What I want to say is that if there is such a thing as natural law, we do not merely presuppose the principles, but we also make a presupposition about the authority of those principles. When I teach this subject, I ask my students if they believe it is unlawful to murder, and they all agree that, of course, it is. On my projected computer screen, and this is now a deficiency of my slides. I did this in my room this afternoon. I tried to make slides, and I should have made a slide for this. On my projected computer screen in class, I then go to the code of the state that I'm located in, say the criminal code of the District of Columbia, and I find the relevant portion which deals with homicide and manslaughter, and I put it up on the screen. And I say to them, will you not murder when you go out of this door, because it is written here that murder is a crime? I ask, or rather, is it the case that because murder is already a crime, the criminal code counts it as a crime? Is it unlawful because of the law, or do we make it against the law because it is unlawful? And all of my students can answer that question correctly and immediately. This is what I'm saying, a presupposition about the status of the authority of the natural law. This authority of the putative natural law comes out directly and can no longer simply be presupposed when thou shalt not kill conflicts with the highest legal authority in a jurisdiction. Because that is so, and it takes tremendous insight and courage to reject the highest legal authority, typically to one's own self-destruction, some of the most admirable persons in history have also been articulate in saying that they base their actions on natural law. For example, Antigone, who, although a fictional character, stands for many who have really lived like that, St. Thomas More, and the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter from a Birmingham jail, which is noble whatever faults the minister may have had personally. But to my mind, the most telling example from our time comes from the Nuremberg trial of Nazi war criminals in 1946. Understand that the Nazi government, after Hitler's accession to power, embraced what was called the leadership principle. But you find this term actually leadership principle all the time in kind of like management theory, right? Führerprinzip. Namely, that all authority, without exception, emanates down from the Führer, from the leader. On this principle of government, there was no licit human law then which could contradict an order from the Führer. But the most egregious war crimes, such as the systematic murder of Jewish people along the Eastern Front, carried out by the notorious Einsatzgruppen, these death squads, these were done directly upon the orders of Hitler, relayed through Himmler and Heydrich. It was not possible in such a context to open up some book of criminal code in Germany and produce pertinent lines according to which the murders were against the law. Moreover, as these murders were not carried out by the army and had no ostensible military purpose, they did not even fall under existing international law for military conflicts. This posed a problem for the Nuremberg trial and the prosecution, as they wanted to avoid as much as possible the impression that the trial was simply a political act, the execution of the remaining leadership of a vanquished nation by the more powerful victors. The trial intended to be a display of right, not merely might. So the Commission for the trial defined a new class of crimes for the purpose, crimes against humanity, which have become famous since then. But to try the Nazis for violations of this newly defined category on its own, without deeper support, would have appeared an illicit enforcement of law ex post facto. Thus, an appeal to natural law became necessary. The American prosecutor at the trial, Robert H. Jackson, an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, remarked in retrospect, a speech he gave in 1947, that it was necessary to reject the idea that, quote, no moral principle is entitled to application as law until it is first embodied in a text and promulgated as a command by some superior effective authority. The fallacy of the idea that law is found only in such a source appears from the fact that crimes were punished by courts under our common law philosophy long before there were legislatures. The modern law of crimes may largely be traced to judicial decision of particular cases earlier than it appeared in a statute. While of late years legislation is more frequent, in England today no statute defines murder or fixes its penalty, and the same is true of many crimes. The early English judge was confronted with an evil act. He dealt with it, unaided by statute, as reasonably and justly as he could. What he did made a precedent, a series of leading cases, each adding something in response to its particular facts, made a body of law. Common law depends less on what is commanded by authority and more on what is indicated by reason. The judge reaches a decision more largely upon consideration of the inherent quality and natural effect of the act in question. He applies what has sometimes been called a natural law that binds each man to refrain from acts so inherently wrong and injurious to others that he must know they will be treated as criminal. And this ultimately was the basis for the execution, the finding of guilt in the execution of these Nazi war criminals. So I'd like to give this example because we're talking about natural law, which is not some kind of theoretical problem in the classroom. This is a wonderful statement by Jackson, and yet it does contain an unclarity about the status of the natural law. Is the natural law, I want to ask, higher than human law or lower than it? His final statement suggests it is higher, a natural law that binds each man. That is, it continues to bind everyone, presumably, whether highest human law contradicts it or not. If the U.S. Congress, for example, were to repeal the D.C. Criminal Code against murder for a time, let's say repealed it for a month and then reinstated it after a month, permitting murder during that time, it would remain the case that murder was still forbidden by law during that period, although not by human law, and that anyone who committed murder during that time could rightly be prosecuted later on the grounds that he ought to have known that murder could not be made uncriminal by the repeal of a statute, any more than it was made criminal by the passing of the statute. But as against this, someone might want to say murder is indeed wrong always, because it is contrary to the best moral principles, and yet no one can be tried for murder based on a mere moral principle that has not yet been enshrined by law. Jackson seems to speak in this way also in the passage. That's the ambiguity I'm concerned about. He rejects the idea, he says, that a moral principle is not entitled to application as law until it is first embodied in a text. And he affirms the idea that violation of some moral principles is so egregious that people must know these acts will be treated as criminal. But this way of putting it makes it seem as if the natural law is the same as morality, which is simply someone's personal point of view about what one should or should not do if it is not yet embodied in law. Morality looks to be something lower than the highest legal authority in the land. Perhaps one might concede a moral principle becomes binding in the absence of law, but how does one person's mere morality trump the highest authority in the land? Remember the Scherer principle and the fact that Hitler had directly commanded many of the crimes against humanity judged at Nuremberg. In our own time, suppose someone takes a typical ethical reasoning course in university and learns 5 or 6 types of ethical theory, as they're called, say hedonistic egoism, intuitionism, emotivism, act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, contractualism, virtue theory. On what basis could he ever have been held liable in court for his failure to adopt and abide by the dictate of one of these theories? Wouldn't he rather always be wrong for putting his chosen theory above what public authority had determined? In short, as a matter of the history of thought, what Robert Jackson refers to as moral principles are probably a descendant of what was earlier called natural law, but how can mere moral principles ever gain the authority which was attributed to natural law and which Jackson even then attributes to them? Okay, so is it the March Madness going on now? Is that why those guys left? Probably, right? Okay, human nature has weakness. We understand. So, in an introductory way, we have said what natural law is meant to be. Namely, first principle so basic as to be presupposed in everything that we think and undertake to do, for which reason they are hardly noticed. 2, which do constrain us not because to ignore them implies incoherence or self-contradiction, but rather through their being identifiable with or closely connected with the end of practical matters. And 3, which have an authority which supersedes all public and private authority. Okay. It goes without saying that natural law so described would be something independent of any putatively revealed truths. If it binds all human beings, then it cannot depend upon or be distinctive of a particular religious viewpoint. And it's important to say, because that's one of the roles, the functions that the phrase natural law plays in our society, right? If Catholic says it's against the natural law to use contraception, say, right? What the Catholic means is that this is binding on even Catholics, not because of revealed authority. Right? But one should add one other thing that people have in mind when they attribute something to the natural law. They mean that there is something usual or nearly unavoidable in accepting it. They think that principles of natural law are easy to accept, that they cohere with other beliefs, that a society based upon them can develop habits which can cause those principles to become entrenched and passed on to succeeding generations, and that the compulsive force of law is not necessary to uphold them. So tomorrow, Anthony Esselin is coming to speak here, and if you read his writings on purity and chastity and marriage, he is, in effect, saying just this. Right? It's easy to live these things. One can create a culture in which they're easy to follow. You don't need force to compel them. There's an inevitability about the way they will continue to suggest themselves. What the natural law requires proves to be a state of equilibrium in society. Unintended consequences, too, work in good directions. Think of the principle of private property, that the work of a Catherine, you proofread this last night, didn't you? Did you balance work correctly with that when you? This is what I learned from Plato. You have to put a humorous interlude in the middle of a difficult philosophical argument. Yes. Okay. Whatever I wrote here, what I meant is that a person should have a claim to the work of his own hands unless some serious consideration pertaining to the common good supervenes. So, is this a matter of natural law or based on a principle of natural law? Well, at least it is thought to have a status such as I have just described. That is, societies have not been able in practice to deny that principle except through force, falsehood, and much hypocrisy, whereas the principle itself seems unavoidable and easy to sustain. All right, so if you want an example of what we're talking about, the inevitable collapse of attempts to implement a communist system. Right? So a lot of people believe that what's going on now with gender and abortion and the whole nexus surrounding the sexual revolution has a similar character. Right? So this is important for natural law. This is part of what the sort of thing it has to be. Right? Presupposed, unavoidable, a superior authority, as though coming from above, and somehow easy and natural equilibrium, which is easily sustainable. Okay. I've said something about what role, okay, so if somebody gives you a theory of natural law and it doesn't account for these things, then it's not a theory of natural law, it's a theory of something else. Right? I have said something about what role natural law is meant to play and what force it is meant to have. Now I want to say something about what might be able to play that role and have that force. So this evening I can't walk you through a theory of natural law, but I'm going to do fundamentals, right, as the title says. So elements, I might have said, or basics, or prolegomena, I might have said, if I were German. Okay. Would a law, which is something natural, be able to play this role? I mean, it's kind of the first thing you think of. Okay, natural law, it has to be a law which is natural. Can there even be a natural law? If you have studied Greek, there are a lot of students of Greek here, right? So Horatio Hornblower, I was watching, actually I was reading the book to my children. Captain Keene asks him when he joins the Justinian, "Did you go to school?" "I was a Grecian." "Sir, can you construe Homer? Can you construe Cicero?" Right. Law is nomos in Greek. Nature is phusis. Right? Nomos and phusis are opposites, aren't they? So it seems like there could not be a law which is by nature, any more than there could be a convention which is by nature. Well, it helps to have, that's just a preliminary objection, which I don't think holds. Right? It helps to have a definition of law. I will use the definition which St. Thomas gives, not because of his authority, although that authority is great with reason, but because he conveys the classical meaning, and in my own experience I have found the definition to be true. St. Thomas says, lex nihil est aliud quam quaedam rationis ordinatio ad bonum commune ab eo qui curam communitatis habet promulgata. A law is nothing other than a certain ordering toward a common good by him who has responsibility for a community which is promulgated. Okay. There are four elements here: ordering, common good, authority over community, promulgated. For there to be a natural law, then, each of these must somehow come from nature and arise naturally, each element. There must be a natural ordering, a common good given by nature, some natural authority, and some natural mode of promulgation. How are these possible? Note that when we speak of what is natural and by nature in this context, we must import an Aristotelian view of nature as involving internal principles of movement, change, and development, and of rest and continuance, which work towards an end or goal within some kind of harmonious system. All four elements of the definition of law must be dealt with. We can't do so at any length this evening. Many interpreters of St. Thomas and proponents of theories of natural law, including the advocates of the so-called new natural law, have gone astray by failing to see this, that all four elements need to be taken into account. They are misled by the manner of presentation of St. Thomas's famous discussion in question 94, Article 2 of the Prima Secundae of the Summa Theologiae. In that article, St. Thomas is concerned solely with two elements of the definition. He wants to show how precepts having the character of law may naturally arise and be formulated, the first element, and he wants to emphasize how these would arise for everyone and therefore could count as universally promulgated, the fourth element. He presupposes, but he does not explain in that article, that those precepts are formulated with regard to a natural common good of a naturally occurring community, and that they are naturally taken to represent the law of a highest authority, the other two elements of the definition of law. The reason why in that famous article St. Thomas discusses only the natural formulation of law-like precepts by everyone is that the article is concerned to answer solely the question of whether natural law is a single thing or has multiplicity. He explicitly says that the article is intended to answer just this question. Of course, the question of one or many commonly arises in an investigation into a subject in the manner of Aristotle. But the advocate, just an aside, I have to take a pot shot at the new natural law. This is just what I do. So please, this aside is for that purpose. But the advocates of the new natural law, because they do not see this, go on to formulate not a theory of natural law, but only a theory of an individual's practical rationality. This is a grave mistake, because the whole point of a theory of natural law, as we saw, is to assert that an individual's practical rationality is already committed to a framework of law. It is antithetical to the viewpoint of natural law that there should be a prior viewpoint of practical rationality or reasonability from which one is meant to reason upwards through some kind of construction, argumentative construction, towards an account of laws as binding on a community. When all is said and done, the new natural law, so-called, offers merely one other type of ethical theory. So first let me consider the idea, I'm going to go through these elements then. So let me consider the idea of a natural ordinatio, a natural setting in order, a natural regulation. Yeah, this is the element I'll consider in the greatest length to show the manner in which one would want to deal with all four elements. A prior idea is that of measuring and setting down a rule for action. An idea prior to that is of action as being measured and as conforming to a rule. So St. Thomas says that law is a regula and mensura. The clearest examples I know of this derived from music. A musical score measures action, and music as performed is action as measured. For example, in the opening bars, opening bar, tellingly called a measure, of the Schubert Great C Major Symphony. The score provides for the playing by the two horns, which are to play an octave above middle C, which is 523.25 hertz, for 2 measures of time at a walking pace, at a relatively low volume, though with emphasis. That is, the very first action of any member of the orchestra is measured or regulated in the dimensions of pitch, duration, volume, and emphasis. One can listen carefully and see whether and to what extent what the horn players actually play conforms to these measures. Everything that an adult does, okay, so this is an absolutely clear example of the measuring of action, right? And in the sense that musical score is like a law. Everything that an adult does is measured and conforms to a measure in a similar way. For example, I wish to count from 1 to 3. Vowels and consonants have a length. Aristotle actually uses this as one of his main examples of length or quantity in the categories. The pitch and changes in pitch will be different whether I'm making a statement, 1, 2, 3, or implicitly asking a question, 1, 2, 3. The time between the statement of each word will be roughly a second in common speech, but speeded up or slowed down with acceleration or deceleration, as, for example, telling a child who's a little bit recalcitrant, 1, 2, 3. I just want you to draw to your attention the rationality that is implicit in everything that we do, how it's so measured throughout. Right. Clearly, if someone waited an hour between each word, he would not be counting. Except if to make a point, like John Cage's composition, do you know this, As Slow as Possible, which changed a note in 2013 and won't change another note until 2020. There's a church in Germany where they're playing this on an organ. Right. And there was a big news item when a note was changed 5 years ago. Note that so isn't that good to know? You can go home knowing that this piece is being performed in Germany. Whatever else is happening in the world, whatever tweets the president is sending out, right? As Slow as Possible is being played in Germany. Good, good. Now that that's been said. Note that actions can be off measure, not merely in degree, but also, so to speak, by object. If a pianist simply strikes the wrong key, piano key, but gets duration and volume right, it is the note which was the object of that action, something measured by the score which is off in that case. I'm saying this, and the provost will recognize, because this has to do with Aristotle's doctrine of the mean, and whether the object of an action is an appropriate dimension on which there can be a mean, right? And Aristotle's often criticized for claiming that that's so. Emotions, too, can be measured as well as actions, and so be off as well in object, duration, and intensity. There's a correct way of feeling anger when you're cut off in traffic, right? And it does not involve grabbing your rifle from the back of your pickup truck. Okay. That's a Texan analogy. Just occurred to me. Okay. So the next thing to consider is so that's measured. The next thing to consider is what I call the distinction between an order and an ordering. An order is something that we see to be true, often within a discipline of knowledge, but an ordering stipulates how things are to be. Consider, for example, the natural numbers 1, 2, and 3. Now here's a slide which is like Whitehead and Russell's. I've composed this exactly for a difficult discussion in a university setting. It's this basic, really. Consider, for example, the natural numbers 1, 2, 3. We see this order and know it to be true when we learn arithmetic. But it is not an ordering, because one cannot speak of a way that it is to be. We can only speak of a way things are to be once an end is set down. For example, is 2 to go before 3 in this sequence, or 3 to go before 2? That's, I mean, the first line in particular. I don't have a laser here. Well, this is the same as to ask, is the sequence 1, 2, 3 going up or down? But there is no fact of that matter, since the list may give the numbers in ascending sequence from left to right, or in descending sequence from right to left. The mere order, which is in the first line, does not say. But once we stipulate an end, then there is an ordering and a fact of the matter of how things are to be. If we stipulate that 3 is the end, then 1 is to come before 2 and 2 before 3. If we stipulate that 1 is the end, then 2 is to come before 1 and 3 before 2. But note that once we speak of the ordering rather than the order, we are no longer dealing with numbers, but with actions. So the reason I'm saying this is there's a slide earlier where I had this distinction between ratio speculativa and ratio practica. And what St. Thomas says about these is, following Aristotle, is that the first has the job of arriving at truth simply, and the second has the job of doing work or contributing to work. So that's what I mean by actions. Once we speak of the ordering rather than the order, we are no longer dealing with numbers, but with actions. The numbers themselves constitute an order for which there is no fact of the matter, whether 2 is to come before 3. So when we say that 2 is to come before 3, we must be speaking of something else besides the numbers, namely something like our internal act of thinking about, or our exterior act of naming the number 2 in an exercise of counting is to come before, in time, our thinking about or naming the number 3. And then note that a measure has thereby been imposed. The ordering implies the measuring or regulation of action. If we say, count the numbers up to 3, which is the end, the measuring is something like say the name for the number 1 first in time, and then about 1 second later say the name for the number 2, and then after about 1 second later say the name for the number 3, and then importantly cease saying number words. This last bit about refraining from action is just as important as the command to carry out an action, just as a rest in music, or you might even say the double bar at the end, right, is as important as a note to play. In counting, it displays that the person counting understood what to count up to or down to. Are the natural numbers a natural order, and do they imply a natural ordering? Well, they are not called the natural numbers for no reason. Everyone comes to know them as a matter of course, unlike, say, the square root of -1. It seems that they do serve as the basis of natural ordering as well, because we naturally count up from 1, not 0, and we do not naturally count down. Why would we count in aggregate by counting down? How would we know where to start? And if we wanted to remove a few items, say subtract 10, wouldn't we identify them by starting from the excess 10? We wouldn't identify them by starting from the excess 10 and working down, but by starting from the first item to be removed and working up, counting up the subtrahend, as it is called. So in the natural numbers, we find a clear example of a naturally known order and a naturally suggested ordering. Indeed, these facts led the great mathematician Leopold Kronecker to say famously, "Die ganzen Zahlen hat der liebe Gott gemacht, alles andere ist Menschenwerk." The dear God, That's his actual quotation in German. You may have seen this in translation before, so I got you the German. The dear God, they always leave out the dear God, right, in the translation. The dear God made all the natural numbers. That's what Zahlen meant then. And everything else is man's work. So that's a beautiful quotation. I've always loved that, right? But it's a great example of what I want for this part of the talk. I want an example of a naturally known order and a naturally suggested ordering. There are many important lessons we can draw from this distinction between an order and an ordering. The first is that corresponding. Okay. The first is that the distinction corresponding to this between speculative reason and practical reason, ratio speculativa and ratio practica. St. Thomas, following Aristotle, held that these two terms refer to different uses of the same power in us, not to two different powers. In the example we have been considering, the point would be, it is by the same ability that we see the order 1, 2, 3, and once an end has been set down, say 3, we impose the ordering that 1 is to come before 2 and 2 is to come before 3. So this is interesting that there's an operation of reason which is one and the same power as simply saying that something is true, which is imposing an order. As for the end that is set down, it is, we might say, chosen arbitrarily in this case. Right? It's up to me to choose 1 or 3. That is, it is purely a matter of will, that's what arbitrarily means, whether we take it to be 3 so that we are to count up, or 1 so that we are to count down. No passions, as Hume thought, enter in. Right? David Hume said, reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. No passions enter in here. Reason in its practical use does not need to become enslaved to anything. So far, it simply affirms, given an end, what actions in a series of actions which amount to accounting are to be done in what order and according to what measures. That the number 1 is to be thought of or named before the number 2 is a true affirmation. It is a practical truth, not a command. It's a practical truth, this term from Aristotle and St. Thomas. A second lesson is this. As you will have noticed, in my view, the correct language to use in expressing this first act of practical reason, of recognizing and imposing an ordering and affirming a practical truth, involves the gerund, as in 1 is to be counted before 2. Right? Not count 1 before 2, but 1 is to be counted before 2. You might ask, is to be counted by whom? And the answer would be, 1 is to be counted before 2 by anyone who purports to count the natural numbers up to 3. The ordering which the gerund expresses is, so to speak, universally applicable. In this first step from an order to an ordering, all that we do is express the objective basis of the ordering provided by the order. In the truth statement using the gerund, there is so far no command to anyone and no law promulgated to anyone. However, a rational obligation or requirement is expressed. We say then how the idea that there is no bridge from is to ought is deeply misguided. There certainly is a bridge from is to ought. Insofar as any objective order, once an end is posited, implies an ordering expressible using gerunds, which states what rationally ought to be done. Further, if an entity which had an end was located within an objective order, then there would not even be any need for an end to be posited as it were arbitrarily, because the fact that an ordering was to be carried out for that entity would follow of itself. Suppose, for example, that natural numbers were not motionless entities, but each of its essence had the goal of seeding to something larger. Then that, in a representation of the natural numbers in time, a representation of the number 1 was to come before a representation of the number 2 would follow simply from that order. Of course, natural numbers are motionless and they don't change and they don't have tendencies. The claim that there is no ordering without an end is another way of stating what St. Thomas calls the first principle of practical reason, namely that good is to be sought and bad is to be avoided. Take a good to be an end or goal, then to posit an end just is to say what is to be sought. And ordering is with a view towards something to be sought. However, okay, now here's the next step. However, and this is important, if there is no ordering without an end, it follows that when we do observe an ordering, we can conclude that there is an end, that we must be able to conclude at least that there is an end, and maybe we can find out what the end is. Consider then this case as an example. Is it the case that every truth is to be affirmed? For example, that 2 plus 2 is 4 is to be affirmed. Is 2 plus 2 equals 4 to be affirmed? That there are 5 pennies in my pocket, if true, is that to be affirmed? That Newton's law of gravitation holds locally in space-time, is that to be affirmed? That DNA forms a double helix, is that to be affirmed? That Schubert's Great C Major Symphony is sometimes listed as his 7th symphony, is that to be affirmed? Without any exception, any truth which can be recognized is to be affirmed. The language is to be affirmed using the gerund expresses an ordering, not an order, therefore some end is implied. Thus, it would seem to follow from the power of recognizing truths, it would seem to follow from the fact that the power of recognizing truths is ordered, it would seem to follow from this, that the power of recognizing truths is ordered to an end. Let us say truth in general, or as St. Thomas would say, verum universale. If every goal is to be pursued, then that same power of recognizing orderings is also ordered to an end, of good in general, of bonum universale. Does it follow from the fact, as we can recognize that every truth is to be affirmed and every good so far is to be pursued, that in virtue of having reason with a speculative and practical use, we are ordered to the truth and the good, namely God? Not immediately, this doesn't follow immediately, but perhaps so with a few intermediate steps along the lines of the first book of Aristotle's Metaphysics. To pursue the argument would take us too far afield, but one would have to introduce comparative judgments, say 2 plus 2 equals 5 is more to be affirmed than that 2 plus 2 equals 50. And then argue that the more ultimate an end, the more it is, or the more basic a cause, the more it is to be sought, the more basic a cause, the more it is to be affirmed, arriving at the provisional conclusion that if there is an ultimate end simpliciter and a basic cause simpliciter, this would be that to which we are ordered in virtue of our having the power of reason. At least this orientation to all truth and everything good seems something transcendent about us, such that, as mentioned earlier, every finding of science concerning the vastness of the universe and the grandeur of its physical laws, while seeming to diminish the standing of humankind, reducing us almost to nothingness, at the same time raises the question of how this apparently insignificant species seems on course to come to know everything whatsoever, and even takes itself to have responsibility for every reality over which it succeeds in gaining some measure of control, such as the environment as a whole right now. The last idea I need to introduce as a preliminary is that of what I called that I want to call the voluntary following St. Thomas and Aristotle. Okay, so the voluntary is what something does of its own accord. Okay, let's take a look at the time here. Okay, so I've been speaking now for 56 minutes. All right, so in this talk, here's another interlude which you may laugh at. I was saying to myself, I actually can't pay much attention to anything beyond 45 minutes these days. I don't know, from blog posts or television shows, or whatever it is. I do think that the kind of unit of rational expectation of attention is 45 minutes. So I wrote to Chris Wolf and I said, you've scheduled me for an hour for this lecture, but I think I'm just going to go for 40 or 45 minutes, if that's okay with you. And he said, yeah, that's fine, because I think that's all that people can really listen to these days. Okay, I just want to tell you that, I've now gone, 9 minutes over what I think is the absolute limit, what you can listen to. All right, so I consider if you can pay any attention at all to what I'm going to say for the next 10 minutes, potentially 15 minutes, it's amazing, right? I'm going to leave Dallas and say, this is Anthony Esolen. This is a breaking of all the corrupt tendencies of modern culture. It's taking place here in Dallas, and I'm going to tell him that tomorrow. That's true. Okay, so the last idea, and I should have no further ideas, right? But the last idea to introduce to you as a preliminary, so it's a preliminary to a preliminary, or it's an introduced introduction, is that of what is called the voluntary. Okay, so this turns out to be a really important notion. So though it's past your time for paying attention, this is very, very interesting and important. Okay, so the voluntary is what something does of its own accord. And this is a very subtle idea I found in thinking about it over time, which brings in related notions of what something does spontaneously, what a living thing is wont to do, W-O-N-T, want to do or likes to do, and what, as a background, makes it possible for some other actions involving a thing, so for something else's actions upon a thing to count as violent or coerced. A very interesting philosophical question. What makes something violent? The old example from Aristotelian physics was a stone. The example is simple enough and conveys the idea well enough, even if not in the end entirely correct as a matter of physics. A stone of its own moves towards the earth, which we explain by appealing to something within the stone, its mass, which is drawn to the mass of the earth. If someone takes a stone and throws it up, the imparted motion is not something the stone does of its own accord. It is not inclined to go up. It is not wont to travel upwards. But it is, as it were, something violent going up relative to what the stone would do. The same idea can be applied to living things, in which case what they're wont to do is the result of nature and habit. For example, my old dog Lulu is wont to sleep most of the day. It is what an old dog likes to do, what an old dog spontaneously does, an old dog does on its own. I might put her on a leash, take her on a walk all afternoon long, but this is not something that she does of her own accord. Of her own, she eats and expels waste, sleeps, and occasionally seeks to be pet, typically during the family rosary. Anything else she does, Pavlovian conditioning. You know the story of David Hume. He was walking next to a loch in Scotland, the Norloch, and fell into it, slipped and fell in. And there was an old woman who walked by, washerwoman, according to the story, and she asked him, and she called him Davy, and sometimes he was called Saint David also by the local, because he was an atheist, but they joked and they called him Saint David. Right? And he asked to be taken out of the water, and she said, I'll lift you out of the water after you say an Our Father. And David Hume insisted that she was the wisest and shrewdest theologian he'd met in all of Edinburgh. So my dog, Hume would approve of the piety of my dog. In human beings, a voluntary points to that with respect to which everything else that we do is in the manner of something either superadded or a necessity, in the manner of removing an obstacle. Is the voluntary for us, now we may ask, something uniform, such that there's just one thing that we do of our own accord, most basically? But it's not even that for Lulu, right? So we wouldn't expect it would be that for us. Is there some kind of complexity or diversification? How would this question even be answered? And St. Thomas, I just wanted to gesture towards his theory, because I think it is basically correct, but it's very interesting. It has lots of problems. He proposes as the requisite method that one look at the distinctions one might draw in what belongs to us in our essential nature as creatures who are rational animals. With respect to each of these, there is, he says, an identifiable, he calls it inclinatio. Right, and some people think of this as like a desire, but In the passage of the discussion of the voluntary in the Summa, St. Thomas refers to the voluntary in human beings as an inclinatio, so we have to connect this with the notion of the voluntary. We are created substance in virtue of which, of our own accord, we aim to keep ourselves in existence and alive. We do not need urging or compulsion to do this. We speak of an urge to stay alive, evident in extreme difficulty such as persecution, torture, and concentration camps. We are in essence animals, and therefore of our own accord, no compulsion is necessary. We are wont to continue our existence through time, through procreation and education of our offspring. Finally, we are rational beings and have an urge to know the truth, to seek what is fully good, as we have mentioned, and live with one another in ways that highlight our rationality. And it's so evident in a child. Like my toddler, Finnan, we brought here, he looks at everything. He investigates everything. If that's not a natural urge which he has, then he has no natural urges. There are 100 difficulties connected with the idea of the voluntary in us. What is the strange way that habits and customs complement such urges? Should these urges be attributed to humankind in general and to individuals for the most part, or to individuals without exception and in all circumstances? How, if these urges pertain to our essence, can someone have lost the will to live, or the will to carry on human existence to another generation, as we see today? Can a person's subjective sense of what is most deeply voluntary for himself overrule what an objective account taken from human nature would imply? How much weight, anyway, can appeal to a putative human essence have today, given the apparently well-established empirical social sciences, and so on and so on? Let's agree that this philosophical notion would have little weight if it lacked confirmation and lived experience. Also, we need to appeal to something like the voluntary if natural law is to have the status that we saw it is meant to have, of something which can be disturbed but which replies in equilibrium, of something that has a higher authority than human law because it is traceable to that being who is responsible for our very nature, and which is a law such that its violation seems to undo us because we take it to touch a lawfulness involving what we most fundamentally want to be and what we most basically live for. Recall, too, that because a law is more fundamental because it is closer to an end, we said that natural law needed to be a serious matter for us, though without, like a logical axiom, requiring that we had to heed it on pain of immediate incoherence. Most importantly, we want natural law to be something that we most basically wish to follow. It comes to us not as something imposed by force, but as what we truly wish to follow if we are truly ourselves. By way of concluding this examination, okay, now I have to warn you one other thing. There are two conclusions in this paper. Right, so this is the conclusion which precedes the conclusion. So hang in there, okay? It's essentially, if at some point, Dr. Wolf is going just to tell me to sit down. So I'm going to appeal to you to rise up against him and keep him from doing that. Okay. All right. Let's return then to the idea that laws in ordering, advancing a common good, set down by someone with authority over a community and promulgated. For there to be a natural law, we said each of these must somehow come from nature and arise naturally. I've spent some time on the notion of an ordering, as it is probably the most foreign to us. We might have examined in detail each of the other three elements too. But as the time measured out to us is diminishing, I should say diminished several minutes ago, and I wish this lecture to conform to that measure, which it hasn't, so I'm being lawless, but it's not the natural law, so I don't feel undone by this at all, actually. I will offer only some brief comments to give a sketch. Is there a natural common good for us in a natural community to which we belong? That is not simply a common good or community assigned to us by nature, but also those which we additionally naturally recognize to be so. Okay, I'm going to skip that, and I'm going to say this about the community. Okay, so I'm just going to tell you what I say in the section. You can get it distributed to you. St. Thomas, in his account of natural law, says that the two most fundamental precepts of the natural law are love God and love your neighbor as yourself. typically neglected in accounts of the natural law. He says this not simply following our Lord, who says that on this the law and the prophets hinge, but also on philosophical basis, that there has to be a natural community for there to be a natural law, and the natural community is constructed as, so to speak, the closure under reflexivity and symmetry and transitivity of beneficence towards those who are similar to us and who we can recognize as other selves. So we form the notion of the complete extent of the relationship of other self, and so we form an idea of a natural community, the human race. Right, so terms even in the Greek world, where say distinction is drawn between Greek and barbarian and slave and free men, there's still anthropos, right? And this means human beings throughout, right? The human family, the humankind, right? And it's very interesting to think about how it has to extend to everybody who is in essence the same as us, pre-born or born, right? Whatever the color of their skin, and so on, for there to be a natural, this is the naturally occurring community. Right. All right, so I just want to say that, and then we have to attribute these inclinaciones, which are traceable to our nature, and the propensity to view the human community as a single community, to the Creator. So natural law is regarded as coming from down from above. Okay, and I'm just going to make this concluding remark. It's done with this. Adolf Eichmann and Otto Ollendorf, two war criminals. This is a cheerful note. Actually, I have one more slide. I think I shouldn't end on this note. When the war, but this is dramatic, so I put something dramatic at the end of the paper. Okay. When the war criminal Adolf Eichmann was captured by Israeli commandos and taken to Jerusalem for trial in the 1960s for crimes against humanity, he defended his behavior by quoting the categorical imperative of Kant. He had done his duty, he said, and Hannah Arendt, who was there, found the matter pitiable and banal, as you know. 20 years earlier, the cross-examination of Otto Ollendorf during the Nazi Nuremberg war trials by a Russian litigator had more drama to it. Ollendorf was the head of one of the Einsatz group and operating in the Ukraine, behind the Eastern Front. He was responsible for the operation by which Jews were taken from villages by the truckload, driven out to a ditch in the countryside, and lined up and shot. 90,000 of them were attributed to Ollendorf, 90,000 murders, to be buried in mass graves. As mentioned, he did this on the direct command from the Führer, from whom he believed all established human legal authority flowed. At the Nuremberg trial, no one asked him which moral theory he subscribed to. Whether he professed belief in Kantianism or race theories was deemed irrelevant. Two matters were thought to be relevant to his guilt: the establishment of the facts, which was relatively easy to do because of the exact records that the Germans kept, and the presence of eyewitnesses, but even only 9 months since the end of the war, but also that his own decisions testified against him. How did he manage to round up all the Jews in a village? It was simple, he said. He asked the Jewish elders for their names, telling them he was going to relocate everyone. That is to say, he used the natural solicitude of elders for their people to murder those people, turning these elders into unwitting betrayers of the people they thought they were caring for. Why did they drive the people from the town to the ditch only one small truck at a time? 10 or 15 people in a truck. They would go back and get some more. Wasn't this inefficient? Wouldn't it make more sense to have used a fleet of trucks and drive them all at once to execute them? No, Ollendorf said, because it was necessary that they not know what was going to happen to them. If there was only one truck, they'd be ignorant that they were going to be killed until the moment they got to the ditch. On the few occasions in which they did discover the truth, they became impossible to manage. Why was it that originally everyone would be brought out to the ditch to be shot? Why did he later change the policy so that only men were brought to be shot, whereas women and children were killed in a different manner, through the method of driving them around in trucks where the exhaust was fed into the back so that they died of carbon monoxide poisoning? That was how originally anyone was killed. By German doctors did this in the 1930s, apart from Hitler's commands to mentally ill and handicapped children. The Holocaust began with medical elimination, euthanasia. And this was the method that was used. Why did he change this policy? Because his own men were deeply disturbed by shooting women and children. And yet Ohlendorf said the men who had to empty the truck were also shattered by this work. Why? Because from the disposition of the bodies, one could see how much they strained to escape death. But the doctors assured him, Ohlendorf said, that they were all unconscious when they died. But why was it that whereas other Einsatzgruppen executed the men by shooting them one by one in the back of the head, Ohlendorf, unusually so, gave orders that the victims were to be executed military style by a firing squad which shot all the men at once? Because he said when the victims were shot one by one, those near the end of the line would often snap from the strain, which his men did not like, as it made the killing more their own action. They'd have to beat them back into submission and then shoot them. Now, of course, if the Jews were like pests to be exterminated, as dictated by Nazi race ideology, these ways of dealing with them made no sense. To have a criminal mind is to intend to act deliberately against what one recognizes as the law. What established that Ohlendorf was a criminal as regards the natural law was not that he was inconsistent in his reasoning or that he failed to recognize a self-evident basic human good, but that the promptings of his nature reminded him of a law, and instead of heeding it as an obedience to a superseding authority, he, through various manipulations, sought to evade its force. And I end this with, on a lighter note, this is outside Langdale Hall at Harvard Law School. Non sub homines sed sub Deo et lege, not under man, but under God and law. Thank you very much.